Welcome to Because It's Not There, a series of conversations somewhere between the theory of climbing and the climbing of theory. This is our second session. And, well, what's the title of our second session?
I don't know if I can pronounce it. Indexis?
Sounds good to me.
What is this before me?
What is this that stands before me? Figure in black, which points at me.
Yes, indexis. What is this that stands before me? And how, what is indexis?
What is it?
Well, it's a mashup of index, which is both maybe the greatest crag in the universe, and the index, as in index finger, as in what points.
And it's where we both started to climb, our original.
And we're interested in juxtaposing, coinciding, integrating, seeing simultaneously in a kind of stereo vision, the question of indication or indexicality as a broad philosophical, metaphysical problem, and the specific climbing area of index. So how did we get to this topic? Do you remember?
One thing that I was thinking about or talking about a lot last time was the role model, or heroes climbing, people that inspired me to climb, that how much you learn from examples, how much you learn from watching other climbers, and that getting better at climbing is not just about having a theory of a practical application to execute, but sort of about having a role model, a fantasy role model to imagine and to emulate. And that's another way I think of saying an index, like a way marker. It's always a little mysterious, I think an index is so appropriate because it is a mysterious kind of weird place, and a unique, super unique crag. But it's been a way marker for sure for me.
Two things about what you said stood out to me. One is that the role model is also a presence, but the presence is also doesn't necessarily mean only a physical presence, but the role model, the idea of the role model is something that you learn from by being in the presence of, and it's the mysterious part is there's always something else that's getting communicated other than the thing that you can quantify or objectify. And I remember from last time when you were talking about role models, you also said that now that certain climbers for you serve as role models for more broadly ways to live, not just models as climbers, as excellence in climbing, but there's this other thing that kind of happens through climbing. And for me, that's interesting because it also gets into this space where climbing, we're talking about climbing, we're pointing to climbing, but climbing itself is the index of something, or can brings other things into presence.
Yeah, and I think as I've gotten older, I think when I started climbing, it was oh, good climber, that's fast. It just, I think that was a big part of the fascination, appeal of climbing, was just that it's so fascinating to watch climbers. And speaking of index, especially crack climbing, just seemed magical at first, and the index has got the most cracks per, the most densest collection of cracks, I think, of any crag. Certainly good hard cracks. So it's just a mesmerizing, just fascinating spectacle.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you learn a lot from watching climbers, but even more, I think, as I've gotten older, climbing. Climbers have taught me about like life in general, like, and sort of, it's not just about learning somebody climb, but like learning about, I think, especially how to balance climbing and the rest of your life is very interesting, because and complicated, because climbing, you know, is again, it's mysterious. So why we do it, it's totally pointless, it's dangerous, it's super hard. And it's all these things that don't really compute in terms of a lot of your normal practical day-to-day values. So seeing how other people do it, it's like learning about life.
As far as indication and climbing goes, the relationship between the two, and more specifically deixis, I guess there's a distinction between deixis and indication. Deixis is indication that happens in a situation of presence, you know, spatio-temporal proximity. And indication is just a broader category of pointing to something, which can happen, I guess, in other ways. But once I started thinking about this, I started, trying to categorize the different ways in which indication and climbing interface. And again, I was thinking of the experience of climbing at the Rock and how we used to indicate problems by throwing little pebbles, gravel, because it wasn't mat, right? It was a gravel ground to absorb falls, and we would throw little pebbles at the stones that we were going to climb. And I just think that there's really interesting continuity between all these different operations of the hand and seeing, pointing something out, and then this kind of pointing that is still just pointing, but it's almost starting to become like climbing or reaching for something. Reaching and throwing. And then I sort of following that path further, and there's really a lot to ponder with regard to embodiment and proprioception, and how climbing actually happens in relation to deictic kind of awareness. Because people talk a lot about proprioception in climbing. There's actually a chapter about proprioception in the volume called Because It's There, Climbing Philosophy for Everyone. But proprioception is also like the ground of deixis. It's that sort of spatiotemporal awareness that's always in the background, on the basis of which our words like here, now, this, that, make sense. But when we indicate things, we're sort of, as I understand, it's a kind of foreground, background, foreground movement. Something is there to be indicated, and that's the kind of proprioceptive type of awareness. But then when we do indicate it, we say this or that, hey, look, right. Then it kind of pops out. And climbing and perception as it unfolds in climbing is, encapsulates that whole kind of horizon where things, we want there to be a hold. It doesn't look like there's a hold. There might be a hold there. You see and or touch for the hold, and then it becomes an actual thing that you conform your body to. But anyway, we can talk more about that later, because I think it's something that can almost be endlessly kind of unpacked, but it's really interesting.
Is another way of saying that difference between index and deixis, like the difference between a local waymarker and like the points of the compass that are universal, that aren't embedded in a place?
I think
like vernacular.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I mean, I think that's like what we were talking about last time in terms of the guidebook, and then getting on the climb. Like the guidebook is sort of a God's eye picture of the climb, but the experience of climbing is the translating from that and then getting situated and having to then rely on this immersed direction perspective, and to find your direction from there. And it's amazing to me how that's always a part of climbing, even in the gym. Like is something, the way a climb seems from standing apart and then jumping on it, there's always a difference. That I think that's a huge part of the finding your direction on the climb. Moving upward, finding upward within a climb. It's always a unique experience that you can't generalize about. I think that's a big part of the pleasure, the fascination of climbing.
Yeah, and I think for this episode, one of the things to kind of have on the table is how that translation from these different views, the more universal to the local, or the more general to the immediately situated perspective, is a translation that happens through language. And language is not just talk on the periphery of climbing, but language is, our bodies are language. I mean, we are linguistic beings through our bodies, and there's not just a language of the mind and a language of the body, but there's a whole continuum of sort of movements of communication, and also talking to yourself, thinking as speech. And so, yeah, I'm just really interested in this way that climbing is. I'm interested in how thinking about indexicality, indication, can help us appreciate how climbing is a linguistic activity. And the word, in terms of the etymologies, it's interesting that ascent, the word ascent, that the scent part, I think, is from scandere, it's like the word scan. And it has to do with reading, and specifically with reading verse and the rising and falling of metric language. So it has to do with rhythmic language, scanning. So ascending is, there's a real conceptual genealogy to this.
And speaking of the rock, remember we used to call routes where you had to follow your feet, follow your hands. Those were called English. You had to, the style was called English.
Can you explain that? Because I kind of don't remember.
Well, I don't remember why we called it English, but we were talking last time about how the cement is so tacky, has such good texture. So oftentimes roots on the rock would follow the embedded rocks for your hands, but then there'd be a question of what to do with your feet, and they could either be English, where you'd use also the embedded rocks for your feet, or not, or no feet, and then you could put your feet anywhere. But I was just struck by that correlation with reading, like English language. I don't think the reference was to language. I mean, maybe it has something to do with body language. You have to use more body language to keep your feet in sync with your hands.
Because I do associate the kind of eliminates and not using your hands and all those kinds of contrivances. I think of that as being a part of early English, bouldering.
Yes.
John, are you there?
Oh, yes. Here we go. Okay, so I just caught it, what you're talking about.
Well, cool. So Bo and I just talked a little bit about indeixis, about the title of the session, and I think we'd like to ask you some questions about both route creation, which you've been involved with in Index for many years now, and also naming of routes. And maybe through that, we can try to articulate a little bit the nature of Index as a climbing area, what's special or distinct about it. But let's talk about the name Index first, just to establish. It may seem kind of whimsical to think about, kind of arbitrary to think about Index in relation to indication. As I understand it, the town is named after the mountain, which was first named by one of the prospectors for its resemblance to a finger pointing to heaven. I mean, do you know anything about the history of the naming of index?
Well, I think that Index was originally a name for what is now called Mount Bering. Yeah, that's what I heard too. It came from the resemblance to an index finger. But what we now call Mount Index, I guess it also looks like a finger or 3 fingers. I kind of wish that it had been named after some native Indian name.
Have you ever thought over the years, have you ever pondered the name index in any way?
Well, myself, I just think of, the finger, how it's kind of a boring name. That's all I have thought about it.
Bo, have you ever thought about the name index, looking back over all these years?
Well, I mean, like we were saying, index to me, it's a little bit mystical and magical. Being the first, crag I saw people climb at, being so hard, and it is so intimidating, this black rock. And the way, it's got a quarry, it's got a railroad track right in front of it. And it's this secluded little kind of turn off this little mountain pass road, with kind of otherworldly sandbagging in the grades. I guess the name index was always part of that strange package for me. And part of it's kind of special allure.
Yeah, I think there's for me, I always felt there was just something mysterious about the name, and I never actually connected it with the index finger or pointing, or it seemed like a strange name for a town. I think usually when I started climbing, my first meaning of index would be like the index of a book, which has, some connection with climbing and listing of routes and tick lists and things like that, which we used to compile. But I also remember very much the kind of the darkness of the place, which was connected with this industrial feeling and the quarry. The quarry was always like pointing to all the climbs that we lost, all the climbs that were not there. Literally, I would try to picture and fantasize about what the Lower Town Wall must have been like before the quarry. And so I think that scarred sense of the place, and then later the tunnel added to that in the country area. I think that's an important part of the vibe of Index somehow, this sense of extractive violence, if you will.
No doubt.
Yeah, and these two different approaches to the stone,
Yeah, now you mention that, I recall thinking how cool it is that a lot of the downtown buildings in Seattle used index granite, right? At least I remember thinking that, and that's part of the story of sort of struggling to find climbable surfaces in the Seattle areas, like buildering around the city. And I remember thinking that was kind of a cool thing that there was index granite there. And that tunnel was made for UW, University of Washington physics experiments, or is that right?
It was an opportunity by this one professor in physics to try to test the idea of a fifth force. Actually, at the time, I was a graduate student in physics, and I was looking for somebody to work with. And I did talk with him, and he gave me a whole stack of papers to look at. And I felt kind of bad because I never returned all of his papers. I didn't feel like being part of that project, but it was interesting. Yeah, the experiment was to test a new idea about a fifth force, and there was another group in the physics department that had a different experiment for it, and they were having a negative result. And I don't know what happened to the fellow in the hole, whether that was a negative result or what. I assume it was.
It'd be cool to get a picture of that or something, but it's interesting that, like the quarry, it's not just on the periphery of the climbing. That the tunnel is like right in the middle of the climbing. So this non-climbing uses of the rock butt up right against the climbing uses.
It's good that the hole was at a place where there weren't any likely routes, you know. Very blank section of rock. It was like the only blank section, I think, in that area. So we were kind of lucky. So,
Well, I remember we used to walk down that tunnel, and it's not very often at a climbing area that you can enter the rock you climb on to that kind of depth. And symbolically, in some way, it's interesting. You have this sort of older industrial 19th century type of industry, and then you have this high-tech experiment, very speculative, fifth force, like almost a kind of mystical, there's the fifth force in the tunnel. I don't know, when you're 16 or 17, those kind of things like are part of your climbing experience somehow, and in some unseen way. John, you're a physicist. You went to the University of Washington. We climbed with you in the 80s at a time when you were studying, I believe, physics. And I was kind of associated in my mind climbing and physics and you. And there were other people at the Rock who were scientists, or I remember talking to, having conversations about mathematics, and I was a math major for a while. Is there a connection between your interest in physics and climbing for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. It did seem like back then, the 70s and early 80s, most of the climbers were with natural sciences or mathematics. There were quite a few geologists, engineers, I suppose. That used to be a kind of a big interest in climbing, was just the mechanics, guys who liked carabiners and pulleys and things. I don't know. My interest in climbing, I think, was more just, it felt good to move the muscles. I started out, though, climbing mountains, maybe age 14 or 15.
Mm-hmm.
Right around 78 or 79 is when I started writing down climbing routes that I had done. So I think that's about when I started. And after that, I hardly climbed mountains.
Mm-hmm.
But the connection to physics, I don't know. I didn't really consider it.
That's interesting that you didn't see a connection. I thought of climbing problems as mathematical equations. That was one concept that I had in my head, not an exhaustive concept, but just some problem solving. And that's one of the connections to indication, and problems or things that are kind of indicated, that are thrown before you. I think the word problem has to do with that. There's this sort of there-ness to a problem. It's like an obstacle in your way, right? Something to be overcome. But interestingly, to solve a problem requires you to kind of do something else. I mean, you have to find a trick, you have to find a means, which is kind of different from the problem. But you climb a hard boulder or route, obviously by means of the route. That's what it means to climb something, to kind of, you have to ascend via its difficulties, but you also have to learn how to do all these other things like jamming or different techniques that kind of don't really have anything to do with that specific problem. And I think in mathematics, there's some sort of similar process of like, there's this problem this thing that we don't know how to prove, or this thing that we're trying to make sense of, and then you have to kind of resort to some trickery, and there can be multiple proofs, multiple proofs of the same theorem. The ingenuity of the proof is a kind of different order of truth than the theorem. And we know from, Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I know Bo's been reading about Kurt Gödel at some point, somewhat recently. There's also these theorems in any, in an axiomatic system that will, by necessity, remain unprovable, kind of climbable, but forever unclimbed routes. Anyway, those are just a few thoughts in connection with the possible links between math and physics.
Kind of like the index. You need a book. You need a abundance of things to be indexed.
Mm-hmm.
A theory has to be applied to some kind of chaotic mass that isn't theorized.
Yeah, maybe there's an analogy there between, I guess there is, between the utility of an axiomatic system and the utility of a book index. You never look up all of the entries in an index, but they're sort of latent there. But a certain number of them are just, for each individual user, I guess, are just going to remain forever unused or unmined.
John, I don't know if this resonates with you, but I remember you when I saw you at the Rock. You were so distinctive, and the term that comes to mind, both in terms of physics and your climbing, is hardcore. And I know you're also into punk music.
Yeah.
And you were into barefoot climbing. You often had a shaved head, I think. And you were just such a solid climber. And your style just seemed very unflashy, just super solid. And I associate that with physics too, just kind of like getting to the hardcore of things. I don't know if those themes resonate with you.
There at the Climbing Rock, we of course like to take a given problem and make it more difficult. So that was kind of an attraction. It was kind of very impractical, and maybe that's one difference between that and mathematics. I do like the connection to problem solving and math, and now, Nicola, that you mentioned it, I think that was an attraction, that it was like a problem solving exercise. So although when I try to solve a problem in math or something, I don't try to make it more difficult necessarily.
I remember your climbing style. I still think of your climbing style as being, what would be the word for this? Not unpredictable, but yeah, kind of chaotically genius. Like I remember Daryl Kramer once said how you could go up on a 5.5 or something and be shut down and get completely sketched out. You would go climb a 512 in your bare feet, and it was like, oh, that was easy, like idiot savant kind of style of like you don't really know. Yeah, like weird beta too.
Well, there's a desire to do things differently, I suppose.
Okay.
And also, I think I might have been influenced by the idea of an anti-style, like do not have a style.
Now we're getting somewhere. Yeah.
There was kind of an anti idea in the hardcore punk music, and probably I had some influence from that.
So a kind of contrarian style, like if I'm gonna do this move, I'm gonna do it in a different way than everybody else.
Yeah, and a certain stubbornness, insistence on doing it my own way, I suppose. I think everybody likes to do it their own way. And even when like you come along and point out a much easier way, there's a great hesitation to change. I got to do it my way.
Well, it's interesting, and I think that might connect with your route names, your style of your route names. We can talk about that in a second, but I do want to just point out is a link to this idea of a contrarian style. Perhaps we can posit one to the nature of indication. One of the sort of animating quotes for this session is this passage from Giorgio Agamben, who writes that the significance of the this in reality is a not this that it contains. That is an essential negativity. The problem of being, the supreme metaphysical problem, emerges from the very beginning as inseparable from the problem of the significance of the demonstrative pronoun. Deixis, or indication, is the category within which language refers to its own taking place. So the link might be in this essential negativity Giorgio Agamben is saying we only access the this, whatever this indicates, or deixis itself, through the not this, like the finger, the classic Zen parable about the finger pointing to the moon. So the Buddha says, don't be the one who looks at the fingertip. You want to look at what is indicated, not what is doing the indication, which is kind of arbitrary. And it signifies, the finger can signify the moon essentially precisely because it's not the moon. So I think there's something to pursue there conceptually about the problem and what indicates it, and climbing a problem as a form of indication, and then your resistance to this participatory style, or doing it, doing the problem the way it has been indicated, to me sounds like I'm a form of indication that's going to retain this essential negativity. I'm going to show the problem. I'm going to demonstrate it through this other thing, right? This thing which is not what has already been indicated. So I'm going to hold on to the negativity of the index. And maybe there is a connection actually with index style of climbing, or the style of climbing that the place index requires of us. It has been known, for kind of trickery and weird beta and inobvious moves, things that don't feel possible until you do something that you never thought about doing.
Yeah. And you immediately forget how you did it.
Yeah.
But I think another way that occurs to me to think about it is in terms of honesty in relation to the question of, conquering a climb or success, achievement. These are, they're illusions. You never, definitively conquer anything. And I think there's a kind of honesty about sort of insisting on this is just me here now doing what I'm doing. There's nothing you can hold on to in terms of an achievement about it.
There's a connection then between indexicalism, use that word, process, and situatedness. That's actually a connection that's been recently investigated in this book on indexicalism by a Brazilian philosopher. But then we also wanted to talk about naming. I mean, naming is something that's, you start naming routes, before, during, and after you climb them.
Yeah. My route naming, I think it's influenced a lot by Greg Olson, is quite different from what the style that most people, or whatever the idea most people have. Most people want to, have a name that's kind of descriptive, I think, of the activity. Whereas we just thought, why not just have a name that's fun to say? In fact, the idea was to be not connected in any way to the type of climbing, the surroundings, the neighboring routes, or anything that people can connect with.
Well, was it just about being fun to say though, or was there something about the way the sound of it recalled the route? Was there kind of a echoing of the route on that level?
Not,
Because I always feel like there's some kind of relationship.
yeah, maybe not intentional, although every rule is broken. And so sometimes, yes, did have some names that were somewhat descriptive, I think, of the type of climbing.
Can you think of examples?
Well, I can think of one very recently that was not about the type of climbing, but about a spider that I saw at the very top of the climb. So that route had the spider's name. It's a very cute little jumping spider on the ledge at the top of the climb, and the name is the Phoedippus borealis. And so I just called the route Borealis. But yeah, those are more exceptions. Most of the time, they should be just very original. They shouldn't be names that other people would have thought of. You know, things like Battle of the Bulge or something, you know, those have been used and overused, I think, probably because they seem kind of amusing, but also descriptive of the action you have to do. But
Well, that's pretty interesting. So there is a continuity then between your personal climbing style, your theory of route naming, your style of route naming. It's paradoxical because it ends up calling attention to the name itself. It serves its function of labeling the route, giving us words through which we can refer to it. But it also pops out and stands out. It takes on this character of itself. It has its own presence as name.
Well, that's it's part of the index culture. Like, I mean, they're taking after the town. And I feel like they've always had interesting names, even the old ones, like just distinctive, like 10%. When was that named? In the 70s or?
That was one of the first routes there at the Lower Town Wall.
And what is the full name? I don't recall.
Oh, yeah, 10% meteorological vinculation.
Yeah, pretty mathy, nerdy, indexy name.
Yeah,
it fits with the older crew of more the engineers and mathematician. Right. Getting back to like the uniqueness, I suppose, of index, it does seem like index is its own place. It like both industrial and also very quaint mountain town. And the climbers there not necessarily adopting the same style as those in other areas like Smith Rocks or Yosemite. Perhaps it's a little bit like a anti or non-style.
I mean, I think of you as a climber who almost exclusively climbs at index. We've been to other areas. You've enjoyed climbing in other areas, but I've always felt like for you, that was like you want to go back home to index.
I did, you know, I lived in Japan for 11 years and became kind of attached to a place there. I think a key reason is that I just like to develop new routes, and it's a place where you can develop and redevelop as much as you like. I don't think index will ever be finished in any sense. There'll always be more things to clean off and develop.
Were you also developing the place in Japan?
I was, yes. I would go out once a week. Yeah, and I'd name them. Naming them, of course, was fun. And I had a list of about 250. I think I had about 250 routes.
Whoa.
Been there. And
wait, just in Japan, 250.
Right, just at this one place.
So you're the like mystical guy that people refer to when they say, I wonder if anybody's ever climbed here before. You're the guy that's been there. It's probably true. There are probably people like you at so many crags, unknown first ascensionists, right?
Yeah, well, people do try to leave a little bit of a indication that they'd been there.
John, did you have a look by any chance at any of those articles that I sent about from the Japanese linguist about climbing?
That was interesting about, the use of the language for describing your position, the climber's position relative to, say, a bolt or something. You are like in the Japanese in front of, whereas you are in the English, you are just before.
He's obviously a climber. He's a linguist, but he keeps going to climbing as a context to investigate principally deictic language, deictic terms, words like here, now.
It's like you're just instantiating a relationship or an orientation through your speech.
One, I'm interested in his charts just because the way they show climbing interfacing with language. Here he makes the observation, for example, that these deictic terms are used with much more intensity with regard to crux sections of climbs. So maybe because of the sense of a crux as intensified presence. This is about a fall, and it has to do, I think, with, sort of imagery building and shifting of perspectives, and how vertical space is constructed in language. Deictic terms have to do with kind of locating the gaze in language. And then he has this other one, which is about vertical space. We have this kind of translation between these two different spatialities. And I just thought this was a fascinating diagram, that there's this in the conversation between, belayer and climber, you have the production of this imaginary body that interfaces between the, upright bipedal human and then the climber, which is kind of inhabiting a different kind of corporeal orientation.
Yeah, it's you see, I think what the language is coding is like a kind of pointing, like this, we're sharing this. You're trying to go through the crux. I'm trying to communicate a certain orientation or attitude it's like you're in the midst of it in that moment of spontaneity. It's like my brain, I'm not like thinking things through, but I can still through my language communicate to you a sort of upward orientation. There's a poetics to that. It's really cool.
Yeah, what do you guys think about gestures of rehearsing a climb before and scoping a climb? And seems like it's become almost a kind of discipline or art unto itself. It seems like pointing and rehearsing the moves are actually happening at the same moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think, well established that's you're, triggering and sort of exercising, warming up, all this kinesthetic awareness, I think, through of just visualizing and imagining. But it's wild to think also that that's social, that
exactly,
like you can learn from each other's imagining, like the climbing is social before it even happens. That's crazy.
Yeah, because you'll see climbers standing, side by side, standing before a route, working out moves, looking at and the moves are actually also simultaneously, the gestures of the moves are also pointing to a certain part of the route, certain holds. And you'll have two people side by side doing this, and it actually becomes a language where it's like this or like this. No, what do you think? Like this? Oh no, I think
right,
this
right.
way. Yeah, okay. And I would love for this scholar to examine that kind of scenario.
That was a golden opportunity. The Olympics just took place there. So that maybe he was there doing that.
Yeah,
what you say about it being a language is so wild, because you're seeing the brain at work, like kind of trying to find these in-between interfaces, where my body links up with yours, and we codify that minimally.
How about thinking about how closely the imagined sequence, as gestured below the climb, relates to how the climber actually does it? I don't think it really correlates all that well for myself. I imagine doing it one way, but rarely can do it that way.
that gets us back into the negativity of indication. The functionality of the rehearsal is not limited by how well it predicts what's going to actually happen or what should happen, or the best beta. It also works by not working. I mean, it works by giving you something to work with. It's the logic of a plan. What matters is to have a plan, and the plan can serve both as something that fails or as something that works.
Right.
And I think that's also how language works.
Like if you throw for a hold, you're not kind of sure what it is or how to grab it. You have sort of a like multi-purpose, like just grip, you're ready for feedback to sort of learn how to grab it, even as just sending out testers to, because otherwise, I mean, I think you're right that it kind of discrimination that if you just go, the alternative is to just throw yourself blindly at something.
And I think the pre-rehearsal is also about the rhythm, kind of smoothing out the climb, giving yourself a feeling for the rhythm of the whole thing, because what you're trying to do is do the whole climb.
So part of what you're internalizing is kind of the rhythm of the climb, like the pacing.
On a few occasions, I've succeeded on a hard route where I attribute my success to believing that I was going to fail before I started.
Right.
So, and which is kind of the opposite of a lot of the positive psychology that you should believe that you're going to succeed.
Right.
But I think the reason that I thought that I succeeded was because I no longer had the stress of disappointing anybody, and then I could succeed. Have you had that experience on some difficult routes?
I know Bo has.
Well, I identify with that. I think it's just a question of attitude. Some people like the direct pitch and some people like the reverse pitch. Like I respond better when the pressure's off. If I've already accepted that I'm going to fall, that I find that usually kind of liberating, and so it makes me more willing to try and keep, experimenting. But I think sometimes also I've had the experience of just being convinced I'm not going to fall, and so convinced that it almost feels like the attitude of the conviction is what's keeping me on there. They're both for communicating a kind of orientation, though, like curiosity. Like I'll give it a try. I don't think I'm going to grab it, but I'm curious what failing will be like. Right. That's a way of keeping on.
Yeah.
You put yourself in the mood. Even if you're not feeling in the mood, you sort of summon the mood because you want to be in that mood. But I think it's bigger than that. I think you lose it when you start thinking, oh, if I think I'm going to fail, then I'll succeed. Then you just replace one thought, then you're back to square one.
For me, the significant alternative is just wanting to have done the climb rather than to think either about succeeding or about failing. So I think that's really crucial, is to have your focus be on the climb. And I mean, or that's just an important question to ask yourself before you do a climb, is if you actually want to do it, or do you want to just have done it? Yeah. And I think having that focus on the experience of the climb itself, whether it's, curiosity about failing or like conviction that you're going to succeed, you're amped to do it for the sake of doing it. I think I have been prone to lose sight of that, and just think like, I want to have done this. And so my mind isn't actually engaging the climb. And I think that's the mistake of that,
John, I think your anti-style could be seen as a form of sticking with the situational process of the climb and resisting any other kind of, it's a form of authenticity or self-doing. Like I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it my way. It's not about fulfilling some objective that has been sort of prepackaged for me, or even for me by myself.
Well, if you're thinking about being very like smooth and looking like you're in control, that can kind of, I think, hinder your ability. I mean, a lot of climbing to me seems to be just to be tenacious and feel like, you know, you're going to fail and just do anything you can to stay on, which is not thinking about any sort of style or looking like, you know, you're a dancer of the vertical, as people used to think of climbing.
But feeling graceful, focusing on your beautiful style, I mean, that can also be a really good way to climb. It can be very enjoyable. Jeff Smoot at the Bouldering Rock was always like demonstrating this problem in this honed style, you know. Your preference for putting up new routes maybe is an expression of what you're saying, the sort of desire to do something else, something other.
A lot of times when you hear about, developing a route, people automatically think, oh, okay, you brushed it off and you put in the bolts. But it certainly is quite different than the coastal rainforest area like Index and Squamish, where sometimes major excavation is needed.
I was thinking maybe your anti-style of climbing is suited to route development in these kind of jungle conditions, because it's like you have to just, you're not worried about like doing things correctly so much as like you're kind of in more experimental mode, like getting up routes that are, you know, maybe just marginally cleaned, or I don't know. It strikes me that that experimentalism of your climbing style seems like it's suited to forging, you know, climbing routes on territory where it's not hasn't been climbed before.
Well, one type of style that I would like to play around with is doing first descents, where you start at the top, and it's kind of would be like doing a ground up first descent, which is very hard to do at Index because of all the vegetation. But if you start at the top and climb down, you can knock things off safely. The leader has the protection of the rope above, and nobody below can knock things off.
It's like canyoneering, but on cliffs.
Except you're actually climbing instead of just lowering on a rope.
You used to like, or still you like to do things which I also like to do with you sometimes. They're just like quirky, like let's go climb this moss infested wall or this dirty climb, and call that, you know, the good. Call that the desirable. Call that.
And let's go do this and pretend like it's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I just saw The Alpinist last night. And I was actually thinking about it in relation to our topic, because they had Reinhold Messner on there talking about alpinism and how it's about this perversity of like going where you're not supposed to go. Like, and he had a funny way of like pointing up as if at the mountains saying, don't go there. You don't belong there. He's like, that's why I want to go there. Yeah, and exploring the boundaries. I think we've got, I don't know, just the explorer instinct. Kids have it. Can kids like to climb? I think it's a vestige of that kind of primal impulse. With all the diversification, niche diversification of climbing, specialization of climbing now, there's not necessarily that same adventure thing of like going out into the foreign territory. That seems to be the unexplored territory. That seems to be part of what you value, John, and maybe that, if climbing was more homogenous in the past, maybe the experience of climbing was still more diverse because it was about going into this more experimental kind of experience.
Well, you certainly saw a wider range of anchors.
So this idea that climbing gives expression to this resistance against, norms or what you're supposed to do seems to connect with the idea of climbing as a form of escape. And if we are concerned or don't feel comfortable with a kind of standardization of climbing, maybe we don't feel comfortable because then climbing no longer feels like a mode of escape out of something. It seems like you're actually entering into. That brings to mind for me the other meaning of the index and that, this, that. It has to do with facticity, right? It has to do with the this sort of inescapable actuality of being oneself, this sort of bind of things. Levinas says escape is basically the desire to break out of oneself, to break out of what he says is like the most binding chain, that the I is oneself. So we can talk about escaping society, but escaping society doesn't really mean anything unless you escape your own society. So John, do you think escape is a good word to talk about in relation to what attracts you to climbing?
There's some element of escape, but mostly it's the idea of creating something. I just like, probably most developers like to create something, and
but for others, or just creating something just per se, just creating something that's just there.
I always thought of it was just to create it, not even imagining other people on it. But a few years back, I was at the base of Zoom there in the country, and a fellow came by, Mike Massey. I didn't expect it, but he was so extremely excited about Zoom, and when he heard that, I was the guy who helped develop it and put it up, he was just so excited about it. And I thought, wow, that's pretty neat. I didn't realize, that people could be so excited about this. And
that's awesome.
So now I think about that a little bit more. It's sort of like, writing a paper or something that, you just like to create it. So it's out there, it's done, and you can go do some other things, and that thing is still there.
I think climbing is really unique in that way, that the kind of creation that you're talking about, John, because I feel like the experience of the climb that you were just describing, Nicola, I think is just an experience of being in a predicament, the facticity, just like you get on a route and it's like you have to deal with it. It's this kind of consuming immediacy and just being in your condition that I feel like is the opposite of escape in a way. It's like thorough presence, like that's what's so appealing about it. But like we were talking about last time, it's sort of this moment that comes and goes, you can't hold on to it, but somehow the route transmits it, to the next person, that's what you're giving to them. It's just like this arena for this experience that you've opened up that's unique for each person. It's cool that it's like there and not there is, our theme.
Escape is, again, paradoxical because we only want to escape from that which we could never escape, that is being ourselves or something like that. But a route, in terms of, the pleasure of climbing, and then this kind of what John is describing, this unintended consequence of this amazing discovery. Oh my God, this thing that I did, and I thought it was just Zoom, and then it turns out Zoom is Zoom. I mean, it's like, it actually exists independent of me. Speaks to the non-consumability, I guess, or, like you can consume it, but it doesn't destroy the object. I think
That's cool.
What-
That's
yeah.
a definition of subculture, that
Mhm.
it's like you're creating a currency, but it's an anti-currency, but it's a currency of a really intense kind of experience, I guess, that we can
There's an-
share, model for each other.
We were talking about proprioception earlier, and this article, I have a passage here from Gunnar Carlson, The Beauty of a Climb. It's a chapter in this climbing philosophy book, which connects this with proprioception, because proprioceptive experiences cannot be purely subjective, as they refer to objects independent of our subjective experience. So the idea is, and then he makes this food analogy that I just invoked, the way climbing route is not like food. Perishable objects aren't properly aesthetic objects because they don't have this independence. If routes are proprioceptive objects, there is a subjective experience as an individual. There's a reading of that route, but the reading also somehow persists in the materiality of the climb and can be, so there really is this intersubjective world of climbing, which routes embody or point to, or something like that. That was also the whole intersubjectivity was also a big part of those linguistic analyses. Like other works of art, climbing routes really do serve this function of materializing like our connectedness.
Climbing routes,
our
like
own experiences are not our own. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
It's like a giant oil painting. It's like laid on the landscape that you have to traverse, you have to climb up it. That's what creates, you're creating that's just say it's fundamentally analogous to an artwork. It's just a difference in media, like you're discovering. It's like, am I put the oil on the paint, or do I discover the route through the landscape? Like,
yeah,
two different sort of mediations of material. But it's the subjectivity. The point is that the subjectivity is embedded in the material in both cases. It's like to have the aesthetic reaction, we have to be in front of the painting to communicate. You have to do the climb to have the experience the value of it.
Yeah, Bo, remember that quote from Gadamer that I sent you when we first started talking about index in these terms? What had to do with the work of art doesn't simply refer to something, because what it refers to is actually there. So I'm just thinking climbing then, when we're talking about a route, or we're naming a route, and particularly if we're talking about naming a route with a name that has nothing to do with the route. Maybe the idea is to sort of seek the name is like the index of that autodeictic dimension of the route. This to know the route means to climb the route, of course, but somehow the climbing of the route is haunted by the simultaneous understanding that that's not the route, that the route is the route, that the route exists apart from you. It has this otherness about it. Well, it's a great story about Zoom, because we have this kind of paradox that what you think you're doing is not actually what you're doing. You're actually creating all these amazing routes for others to enjoy, and these non-signifying route names are becoming classic route names.
Yes,
you're not able to escape at all the conditions of the climbing world, but that ends up being better. And what do you think about the number of Black Sabbath themed routes going up on the Diamond, given that the theme song for today's episode is all about pointing, deixis, what is this that stands before me, figure in black which points at me, which in my mind now is about index. There is actually a topo up on Mountain Project, which interestingly posted all in black.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of route names are named after songs, and clearly the person familiar with the song, hears the name much different from the other guy. We had a few. Sonic Reducer and Terminal Preppy were named
Right.
after songs. To us, we associate the climbing with, I don't know, the feeling in the songs. People who haven't heard the songs, they might be somewhat mystified or certainly have a much different feeling for it.
Yeah, speaking of like indelible memories, listening to Jimi Hendrix at Mount Erie, listening to Kraftwerk just continuously on road trips. I mean, it's that theme of climbing as art. What strikes me is, and what you said, John, about the beauty of familiar routes, it strikes me that a difference that gym climbing has caused is that the best climbers don't reflect local cliffs the way I think they did at one time. Like it was, you could think of Peter Croft as a product of Squamish, like what made him, his style of being a great climber had something to do with the cliff. It was his greatness was somehow an expression of an echo of the material cliff itself, but we've lost that connection. Now climbing's just, in terms of competition climbing at least, a closed loop, it seems like, of like we're creating the arena against which you'll test yourself. So that's got to become a little lose that experimental element to some degree, where we're always designing somehow the challenge. We conceive it before the climb, whereas that seems different from like learning from the cliff how to climb it. You're the potential experiment is just got to be like broader.
Was there a connection to music?
It's just interesting to think about the reflection of music and the rock and climbing, like, and music and dancing, like to what extent are these kind of proprioceptively dictated by a particular place, a particular, context of performance, I guess dictated by nature, versus just kind of created independently of place? They seem like interesting questions, just because I think what I was just describing is how music can be a spot of time, like it can embody a memory in a particular place.
Beyond that, naming a route, not the route name that's about nothing, but the route name that points to a song, I just think it's an interesting gesture, because you're tagging this thing that's not a song with this song. It's like taking something else's name but applying it to a route. There's something really interesting in that, in the non-connection.
Yeah, names are conventional, labels, just like, to be naming is to be participating in a convention. So it's a kind of flag planting, but I think the more poetic it is, the more or musical, it's speaking to not an ownership, but it's an homage. Again, a kind of index, like I'm part of a flow of a stream of a counterculture or something. That's undermining the pretense of a, proper name of ownership.
And John, haven't you been criticized for the length of your names?
Yeah, that was funny. By stacking the syllables on top of each other, you can bypass the crux. Yes, that was a good one. Yeah, obviously, when they get to be more than 3 or 4 words, people will abbreviate them.
Well, in that case, you're the Zen master who's saying, like, look at my finger. So you're not looking. You're sort of
not at the route. Yeah.
I think I noticed a analogy between your excessive idiosyncratic route names and your appreciation for over vegetated out of the way, quirky first ascents.
It'd be fun to actually go through the index of index and try to point to which names, try to indicate John's names.
I mean, isn't that, that Messner thing about you're not supposed to go there? Like climbing is, especially a place like Index, is kind of finding as many places you're not supposed to go as possible, like just exploiting the territory for maximum unlikeliness.
Isn't that the negativity of freedom, or the negativity of something that's substantiated in the no more than the yes, right?
Yeah, it's
no.
essentially perverse. Like I show
Yeah.
my freedom by just disrupting somehow what's there. My subjectivity is basically an absence that I'm always realizing only by making a difference, which is a negative.
But then it becomes
But
this
we-
whole space of play. I mean, I know you like to just come up with route names as an activity unto itself, right?
It is an activity unto itself, yes. It's also, I think, a way that of trying to make climbing not become like any other activity, to make these things that are, they shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have such weird long names, say, or,
Yeah. I mean, in a way, the name is just an extension of the perversity of climbing it in the first place. Like,
Yeah,
not
that's
only
what
am I
we're
going to
getting
do the
at.
crazy thing of climbing it, I'm going to put a name on it. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I think that's what we're getting at. I mean, the activity of coming up with names then would be a way to make even not climbing. Like, I'm not climbing, I'm coming up with a list of names, but this is still climbing.
right.
Well, yeah, and if you include, the creating of routes as part of climbing, it's a very different activity,
Exactly.
but it's also share some of the same spirit of climbing, that you're really not
Yeah.
doing what people expect you to do.
Well, so that's another way of thinking about this experimentalism that Bo was talking about, that it's not really about trying different ways of doing the same thing, but it's about finding ways to do something without doing it otherwise. In my own writing, I've had this thing about this sort of the mystical form of potentiality, which is like, there's doing what you can do, which is ordinary activity. And then there's not doing what you can do, which is this sort of the no, the suspension, and that's where like potentiality gets revealed. Like if you can play an instrument, you can also choose not to do it. There's doing what you can't do, which is kind of like achieving the impossible, or some kind of extra heroic kind of doing. And often climbing seems to occupy that zone. It's in between doing what you can do and doing what you can't do, kind of tries to stay at the threshold. But then there's this other kind of, the darkest form of potentiality is like doing what you can't do by not doing, like suspending. So, and I came to this through sort of some mystical texts that talk about sorrow and penthos as a kind of, like you're supposed to weep for your sins, but you can't, but you sort of do it anyway.
Through that failure,
Your inability, your failure, inability to do what's required of you becomes the very authentic.
Yeah. It reminds me of our earlier discussion of like falling your way up the climb. Like by expecting failure, it's like you trick, that's how you get yourself up something that's impossible. Like I can't do that, but I'm going to do it anyway. So it's by just all these failures, like for it not, it's not being the impossible thing. It keeps like not being it. And then all of a sudden I'm at the top.
Yeah. If I can fail all the way, if I can fail the whole climb, fail every month.
Is that like thinking, well, I'm just gonna go up to this point and then I'm gonna come down, but then you get to that point and you say, well, I'm just then gonna go up to this next point and come down. So
Yeah, or
what
just
you're-
I'm gonna fall grabbing for the next hold. Like each
Oh, yes, I see.
each of my moves is actually I'm intending to fall to the bottom, but
You're
I
gonna fall
just
off
keep by
every hole.
accident keep
Yeah.
going up.
Oh, that's classic. So I thought that was one of the best feelings of climbing is when, as
Mhm.
Bo was saying, you're pretty sure you're gonna fail, but you just do it anyway.
Yeah,
And so you're just surprised. You're surprised that you're still on the rock. And I always thought that was one of the best, most memorable experiences climbing.
absolutely.
Yeah, I agree.
I remember we were in Squamish once and I was super tired. Remember we were climbing up that route, New Life?
Oh, yes.
And we were like, we had already done like a lot of climbing and we're like, oh, let's go climb. And I remember just roping up and feeling super tired and thinking, wow, maybe I shouldn't really start up this route. But then I thought, well, something else will climb it for me.
You know, the thing I remember about New Life is, well, I mean, that was a great climb. I had good experience on the climb, but the most memorable part for me was the descent.
Oh yeah, the tree, speaking of trees,
I love the descent. So,
the best.
I mean, I could
yeah.
almost imagine I'm going to go back and do the climb just so I can do the descent.
Just for the ascent. The other inspiration for this topic that we was that Bo reminded me that I used to have a shirt that I made, and I made it to say index hub of the universe.
Earwax wall.